The convoy had been carrying children. That was the detail that cut through every briefing, every tactical readout, every coldly worded incident report that passed across Commander Sira Voss's desk in the 48 hours that followed. Not the tonnage lost, not the strategic value of the relief corridor, not even the 4 soldiers dead at their posts, still belted into their jump seats when the wreckage was eventually recovered. The children, 19 of them, evacuated from the Callaway Station settlement, ranging in age from 4 to 11. They had been tucked into the rear compartment of the 3rd transport with emergency ration packs and hand-drawn pictures of the families waiting for them at Reach Colony. The pictures were still there when the forensic teams arrived. The children were not. Voss sat with that fact for a long time before she moved. She was 53 years old. She had served in 3 separate engagement theaters against 2 alien civilizations, and she had never, in all of that, lost a child under her protection. It had been something she carried like a personal covenant, unspoken, written nowhere, but absolute, that the geometry of her choices would always include a margin wide enough for the small ones to pass through safely. The Vothran Compact had just erased that margin. They had done it deliberately, precisely, and without warning, and the telemetry recovered from the convoy's emergency beacon told the full story in 17 seconds of data before the signal went dark. The Vothrans had known the convoy's composition. They had known the route. They had waited. She called for her adjutant at 300 hours and told him to wake every senior officer on the Perseverance, not the ones on duty rotation, all of them. Every captain, every wing commander, every tactical advisor, every logistics chief. She wanted them assembled in the main briefing amphitheater within the hour, and she wanted the recovered telemetry looped on every display in the room when they arrived. "What's the occasion, Commander?" her adjutant asked. He was young. He still asked that kind of question. "We're going to make a decision," Voss said, "and I want everyone present so that no one can claim they weren't." She didn't sleep in the hour before the briefing. She stood at the observation port and watched the stars and thought about a girl she'd met 3 weeks earlier at Callaway Station, a serious-faced 7-year-old named Pell who had insisted on shaking Voss's hand with enormous formality, and then asked, in complete seriousness, whether Voss had ever personally fought any aliens. Voss had crouched down and told her yes, once or twice. Pell had nodded gravely and said she planned to do the same when she was grown, but that she was also going to be a marine biologist. Voss had laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind that catches you, and told her those 2 things were not mutually exclusive. Pell's name appeared on the casualty manifest under the column marked Unrecovered. By the time Voss walked into the briefing amphitheater, her decision was already made. The meeting was not for her benefit. It was for the record. The record mattered. The record was how history understood what came next. The room was packed in a way she had never seen it packed. People were standing along the walls. Someone had dragged chairs in from the adjoining corridor. Fleet Captain Arden Moss, who had commanded the Perseverance's sister ship the Unbroken for 11 years, and who was not, by any standard, a man given to visible emotion, stood near the back of the room with his arms folded, and his jaw set in a way that Voss recognized as barely controlled fury. He had seen the telemetry readout. They had all seen it. The readout did not require interpretation. It stated its facts in the clear, bloodless language of sensor data and forensic reconstruction, and the facts stated were sufficient. Voss didn't use a lectern. She stood in the open space at the front of the room and waited for the last of the conversations to die. "I'm going to tell you what happened," she said, "and then I'm going to tell you what we're going to do about it." The room was very quiet. She walked them through it methodically. The Vothran strike package, 3 cloaked interdiction vessels, positioned in a precise triangular formation that suggested advance reconnaissance of the convoy's exact path, not a patrol intercept. The timing, which corresponded to the 15-minute window when the convoy was furthest from any Allied response platform. The nature of the weapons used, thermal suppression charges designed not to destroy the transports outright, but to disable life support systems. A choice that spoke to something deliberate and unhurried and profoundly cruel. Not the cruelty of carelessness, the cruelty of intention. They wanted the people inside to suffocate, Voss said, and let that land. They had time. They chose this method. The children in compartment 3 of the third transport had approximately 4 minutes of breathable air after the attack. She paused, and that pause had weight. She let it. I'm telling you this not to make you angry. You're already angry. I'm telling you so that when we file this report, and every word of it becomes part of the permanent record of this war, no one will ever read it and wonder whether we were provoked. Fleet Captain Moss uncrossed his arms. In 11 years of serving alongside the man, Voss had learned that this specific gesture, the uncrossing, the dropping of the arms to his sides, the slight straightening of his posture, meant he had reached a conclusion. Moss was an analytical man. He reached conclusions deliberately, and he stated them plainly. "What are we authorizing, Commander?" he asked. "Everything," Voss said. She had not planned the word. It arrived on its own, clean and precise, and once she had said it, she found she had nothing to add to it because it was already complete. Everything. Every asset under her command. Every Allied formation that could be raised in the next 72 hours. Every weapons platform, every interdiction system, every deep penetration strike package that had been sitting in readiness protocols for months waiting for an authorization code she had never believed she would have to use. The Vothran Compact had a staging base. They knew this. It was a structure the size of a small moon, anchored at the gravitational midpoint between two uninhabited systems, and it had been sitting there for 8 months while diplomatic channels ran their slow, polite circles. Intelligence had designated it the Cradle, because the Vothrans appeared to have been building something inside it, something they had not chosen to disclose in any of the negotiations. The convoy attack had ended the diplomatic question, with 17 seconds of telemetry and 19 names. "Before I give any orders," Voss said, "I want a full assessment from every department of what we can bring to bear on the Cradle within 72 hours. I want realistic numbers, not optimistic ones. And I want every Allied command in communication range notified within the next 2 hours that we are convening an emergency response council." "They'll push back," said Commander Yusuf Darin, her tactical chief. He was careful with his phrasing when he pushed back on Voss, because he had learned early in their working relationship that she didn't object to pushback. She objected to pushback that wasn't accurate. Some of them. The Cathani Compact has been reluctant to escalate. The Anric sovereignty is in a delicate phase of their own internal negotiations. "They saw the same telemetry we did," Voss said. "Let them push back in person." She dismissed the room. As the officers filed out in ones and twos, Moss stayed. He waited until the last person had cleared the doorway, then walked forward to stand beside her at the display still cycling through the convoy footage. The distant burst of thermal suppression charges, the slow tumble of the disabled transports, the absolute silence that followed. On the recording, the silence after the attack was 63 seconds long before the first automated distress signal began its futile loop. 11 years, he said quietly. "I've been out here 11 years, and I've never hated anything the way I hate them right now." "Good," Voss said. "Hold on to it. We're going to need it disciplined, though, directed." "It's directed," Moss said. She believed him. What she didn't say, what she was still processing, turning over in her mind with the same cold precision she applied to everything, was the intelligence report that had been waiting on her desk alongside the convoy telemetry. The one marked priority urgent that had come in from deep penetration reconnaissance drone Sable 9, 47 hours before the convoy attack. The report described unusual energy readings from the Cradle. Readings consistent with the profile of a harvesting device, something designed to collect and process biological energy signatures. Specifically, the energy signatures associated with extreme emotional states in sapient species. Grief, terror, rage. The Vothrans had not attacked the convoy because it was a strategic target. They had attacked it to create a response, a specific kind of response, calibrated to produce the maximum possible output of a particular kind of energy that they apparently needed for something the technical teams had not yet been able to fully classify. The cradle was not a fortress. The cradle was a battery, and the Vothrans had just decided it needed a final charge. Voss had sat with this information for 2 days and said nothing about it publicly, because the alternative, saying nothing and allowing the Compact's diplomatic shell game to continue, was not actually an alternative. The children had still died. The convoy had still been destroyed, and whatever the Vothrans were harvesting, they had chosen this method, which meant they were willing to kill children to fuel it, which meant there was no version of restraint that ended anywhere good. The response would be immediate. It would be absolute. And if the Vothrans wanted to harvest the grief and rage of humanity, they were going to discover very quickly that they had catastrophically miscalculated the yield. The Allied Response Council convened 14 hours later aboard the Perseverance. Voss had expected resistance from the Cathani delegation, and she had prepared for it methodically, briefing materials organized in descending order of impact. The convoy telemetry saved for last, not first, because she understood that information absorbed in sequence had a different effect than information absorbed all at once. She wanted the Cathani delegation to know what they were looking at before they saw it. She wanted the horror to have context. What she had not fully anticipated was the silence that fell over the room when she played the convoy footage for the assembled commanders from 7 different Allied formations. 17 seconds, then silence. The Cathani senior delegate, a tall figure named Ashenmar, whose species communicated partly through shifts in skin chromatophores, baseline being a deep blue-green that shifted toward yellow under stress and red under anger, sat through the entire 17-second clip, and then sat for a very long time afterward. Voss watched the chromatophores on his neck and shoulders cycle through yellow, then deep yellow, then into a color she had not personally observed on a Cathani before. Her xenobiologist had told her, when she'd asked later, that the color had no clean translation. The closest approximation was the word in the Cathani third language, their ceremonial language, that meant a grief so large it has resolved into action. When Ashenmar finally spoke, his translator rendered it simply. We were told this was a military engagement. It was, Voss said. The Vothrans classified it as such. The passengers were non-combatants evacuating a civilian settlement. Another long silence. In that silence, Voss heard one of the Anric sovereignty delegates, a compact, dark-featured being she had not previously met, who had arrived with the small Anric contingent without being summoned, make a sound that her translator classified as untranslatable, but her gut classified immediately as the sound of something breaking cleanly, like a restraint letting go. We have children, Ashenmar said at last. We have a word for what was done here in our oldest language. It is not a military word. It is not a diplomatic word. It predates both. He looked at Voss steadily. The nearest equivalent in standard is an act that removes itself from the realm of politics. He sat back. We will commit 3 full carrier wings, he said. Whatever else you need from us. The response council concluded in 4 hours and 16 minutes. The Allied force assembled over the following 56 hours was something Voss had never seen in her career, not in scale, but in character. It moved differently than military force usually moved. It didn't have the grinding, logistical heaviness of a standard campaign buildup. It had the quality of something convergent, like water finding a level. Like separate currents discovering they were already part of the same river, and had been all along, and only needed an occasion to realize it. There were formations in that fleet that had never fought together. There were ships from species who shared no common language beyond the translation protocols they had downloaded in the last 48 hours. There were veterans who had survived the Margin War and veterans who had survived the Skarath incursion and young soldiers who had survived nothing yet, and were about to find out what that felt like. There were human fighters and Kethani carrier crews and a small, ferociously armed contingent from the Anric sovereignty that had arrived without being asked, transmitting only a single line of text. "We heard what happened. We came." Nobody had debated their inclusion. Voss had simply acknowledged the transmission and assigned them a position in the formation. She looked at the assembled fleet on her tactical display the night before the operation and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction. It wasn't the right shape for satisfaction. Not comfort. Something older and quieter. She thought about the stories humans told about themselves, the oldest ones, the ones that kept recurring across cultures and centuries, and in the mouths of people who had never met each other and would never meet. The stories about the thing that happened when you hurt what was small and trusted and undefended. About how it reached something that normally stayed dormant. About how what came after was not rage exactly, because rage was something that could be reasoned with and cooled and redirected. What came after was the other thing. She pulled up the mission file and input her authorization code. The designation she had chosen for the operation was simple. Response. No subordinate designation codes, no theater identifiers, just the one word which she felt was adequate. Captain Marin Solis was 28 years old, and she had been flying intercept fighters for the Perseverance's wing for 3 years, and she had been on the convoy escort roster the day the Callaway children were transported. She had been rotated off 12 hours before the scheduled departure, due to a maintenance issue with her fighter's navigation array. The maintenance team had found nothing wrong with the array. They suspected a calibration ghost, fixed it, and marked the file closed. She had been drinking coffee in the crew lounge when the emergency beacon telemetry came in. She had put her coffee down and not picked it up again for 2 days. In the 56 hours of fleet assembly, Solis had been running diagnostics, running drills, running the same approach vectors on the simulator until her co-pilot had finally told her, gently but firmly, that she needed to stop and eat something. She had eaten something. She had then returned to the simulator. Her co-pilot, whose name was Rafferty and who had known Solis for 3 years and understood her specific texture of grief as focus, had said nothing more about it. She was not unusual in this. The Perseverance's entire fighter wing had been operating at approximately 140% of standard readiness parameters for 2 days. The maintenance crews were working in shifts that violated every wellness protocol on the books. Nobody said anything about it. The chief medical officer had quietly doubled the stimulant dispensary allocation and said nothing to anyone, and had not written the deviation into the official log, which was technically a protocol violation, and which she had decided she could live with. The briefing for response came down at 600 hours the day of the operation. Solis sat in the briefing amphitheater with 63 other pilots and listened to Commander Darren walk through the approach geometry with the flat, efficient cadence he used when the information was complicated and the timeline was short. 3 waves. The first wave, heaviest capital ships, Kethani carriers included, would emerge from FTL at the designated approach corridor and immediately begin suppression fire on the cradle's external defense grid. Intelligence had identified 14 primary grid nodes. 12 needed to be eliminated within the first 4 minutes to prevent the grid from adapting and closing the approach window. "The cradle has internal structure we cannot fully map," Darren said. Sable 9's reconnaissance identified at least 7 distinct interior chambers, one of which appears to be the primary harvesting array. "The array is our priority target. If the Vothrans activate it with our fleet in range, we don't know what the effect on crew cognitive function will be. The working assumption is that attempting to harvest grief and terror from 60,000 armed beings will not produce the result the Vothrans are hoping for. The secondary working assumption is that we'd rather not find out. How worried should we be about that? Someone in the back row asked. Darren looked at them for a moment, worried enough to hit the array in the first 4 minutes alongside the defense grid. The briefing continued. Solis absorbed it with the detached clarity that had replaced her usual pre-mission tension somewhere around hour 30 of the prep period. She was not calm exactly. She was past the point where the difference between calm and not calm felt relevant. There was only the mission and the geometry and the 19 names she had written on a piece of actual paper, not a data pad actual paper, which she had found in a supply closet and had spent 15 minutes locating a pen for, which she had folded carefully and placed in the left breast pocket of her flight suit, close to where a heartbeat was. She was not the only one who had done something like this. The culture of the wing had its specific textures, and this was one of them. The physical talisman, the small material anchor to the reason. Photographs, letters, drawings made by children the pilots knew from their families back on settled worlds. Before the briefing ended, one of the older pilots, a man named Crutchett who had been flying interdiction for 15 years and who rarely spoke outside of strictly tactical contexts, stood and held up a photograph. It was a standard child's photograph, taken at a school event, slightly blurry in the way of photographs taken by other children on borrowed devices. The subject was a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 with a very serious expression and a handmade badge pinned to her shirt. Future marine biologist. Her name was Pell, Crutchett said. She was one of ours. I want everyone in this room to have seen her face before we go out there. He set the photograph on the front table, facing outward, and sat back down. Nobody spoke for a moment. The amphitheater had 64 people in it, and it was silent in the particular way of spaces where everyone is having the same thought at once, and nobody wants to be the first to break what the thought has made. Then Solis stood up, reached into her left breast pocket, and unfolded her list and placed it next to the photograph. After that, others stood. It took 7 minutes for everyone who wanted to stand, and Voss, watching from the back of the room, did not rush them. When the last of them sat back down, the table at the front of the room held photographs, slips of paper, a child's drawing, a folded letter, and one small stuffed animal that belonged to someone's daughter and that someone had apparently brought out here to the edge of settled space and never mentioned to anyone. 7 minutes was not a long time. 7 minutes was the least they could give. The fleet made translation to normal space at 8:14 hours and 18 seconds. The cradle filled the tactical displays immediately. A structure so large it registered first as a geographic feature, a mountain range floating in vacuum, before the eye adjusted and the mind caught up and understood it as a made thing. It was dark metal and dark composite, with running lights strung along its equatorial band like a city seen from altitude, and it was already moving in response to their arrival. Defense grid nodes lighting up in sequence as the Vothran systems processed the incoming fleet. Automated targeting brackets appearing on the displays. The mathematical machinery of defense spinning up. 14 nodes active, Darren said from the tactical station. His voice was flat and precise in the way it always was, in the way Voss had come to understand was not coldness, but a specific kind of discipline, the removal of anything that would slow the information down. Grid completion in approximately 38 seconds. All wings, Voss said. Execute. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be parsed, analyzed, debated, and documented for decades afterward by military theorists and historians, attempting to understand how an engagement of that complexity had achieved its objectives with the speed that it did. The tactical models that war colleges used to reconstruct it would consistently underpredict the performance of the Allied fleet by margins ranging from 12 to 22% depending on the metric. Theorists would write papers about resource allocation and formation geometry and interspecies communication protocols, and the specific advantages of the Kethani carrier's secondary drone deployment system. These papers were not wrong. They were also not complete. The short answer, which Voss gave in the official after-action report, and which she considered both accurate and sufficient, was that the fleet executed the plan. The longer answer, which she did not put in the report but which she thought about often in the years that followed, was something harder to quantify and harder to fit into the language of tactical analysis. She had watched a lot of fleet engagements from a lot of bridge stations, and she knew what a fleet looked like when it was performing. This had not looked like performance. This had looked like intention. The Allied fleet struck the cradle's defense grid with a precision that exceeded every projected timeline in the pre-mission modeling runs. 12 grid nodes were destroyed in 3 minutes and 41 seconds, 19 seconds ahead of the best projected outcome. The remaining 2 were eliminated in the subsequent 11 seconds by a pair of Kethani carrier drones operating independently after their pilots identified a firing solution that the Central Battle Management AI had not flagged as optimal. This was not in the plan. Nobody told them to do it. The solution presented itself and they took it, and the result was that the cradle's defense grid went dark 4 minutes and 52 seconds after the fleet emerged from FTL, and the approach window opened clean. Voss noted it in the real-time log and moved on. Captain Solis' wing took the approach corridor along the cradle's equatorial band, the section where Vothran intercept craft were deploying in tight defensive patterns, fast and numerous and clearly piloted by beings who knew their machine's capabilities and were fighting for something they valued. The intercept craft were better than the intelligence estimates had suggested. They were faster in tight maneuvering envelopes, and their weapon systems had a cycle rate the Allied fighter wings hadn't fully accounted for. In the first 90 seconds of the engagement, the wing lost 2 fighters, Rafferty's co-pilot, who ejected successfully and was recovered, and a pilot named Shen whose fighter took a direct hit to the drive coil and came apart cleanly and quickly, and who did not eject. Solis did not think about Shen while she was flying. She noted it, noted the marker going dark on the formation display, noted the voice check that came back empty, and she filed it in the part of herself where those things went during a fight, and she kept flying. She had been waiting for this corridor for 56 hours. She flew it the way she had flown it in the simulator, except that the simulator had not included the weight in her chest pocket or the 72 hours of disciplined fury that had been building since the moment she'd heard the telemetry readout in the crew lounge with a coffee cup cooling in her hand. The knowledge was not weight. She had expected weight. It was something more like propulsion, a compression seeking release in a specific direction. She tracked and she fired and she displaced and she re-engaged, and she did not waste a single second of weapons lock, not one, and the wing held formation with a tightness that their post-mission telemetry would show was 4% beyond their previous best collective performance. 4% is not a large number in most contexts. In close quarters intercept engagements against a comparable opponent, it is the difference between a margin and an outcome. The Vothran intercept squadron broke in 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Not destroyed. A significant portion of their craft were still operational, retreating toward the cradle's secondary docking channels in a defensive regrouping pattern that suggested an organized commander rather than a rout. Solis filed this also and notified the fleet tactical coordinator, who adjusted the second wave's approach to account for the reformed Vothran position. This was how it was supposed to work. The plan was a living thing, and everyone in the fleet knew how to feed it. While Solis' wing was clearing the approach corridor, the first ground assault teams had breached the cradle's outermost access junctions using thermite-class cutting charges and were moving inward. The Vothran internal defense forces were not where they were expected to be. The positioning was wrong by several significant factors, attributable to an intelligence assessment that had predicted human assault teams would breach at the northern access junctions based on prior tactical patterns. The actual breach happened at the southern junctions simultaneously. a recommendation that had come from Ashenmar's tactical advisory staff, who had years of prior contact with Vothran architecture and understood the internal flow patterns of Vothran-built structures in a way that human intelligence had not fully mapped. The Kethani ground units and the human assault teams moved together through the cradle's interior corridors, and they moved with a speed that no one involved would quite be able to explain afterward. Sergeant First Class D1, who was leading one of the forward human elements, would say in his after-action report that the Kethani units were the best he had ever worked alongside, which was high praise from one, and that they moved like they had trained together for years, which they had not. They had trained together for 11 hours the night before in a simulation bay aboard the Perseverance, running the mapped corridors until the pathways were in muscle memory, and one had spent most of that 11 hours convinced the timelines were too tight, and then they had executed, and the timelines had been fine. The cradle's internal security was layered and adaptive, and it was staffed by Vothran personnel who were not negligible adversaries. The assault teams took casualties advancing through the midsection corridors. One took a glancing hit from a Vothran-directed energy weapon to his right shoulder that burned through the suit but not through the underlayer, and which he did not report to the medical team until after the array was down. He would explain later when asked that there had not been a convenient moment before that. The harvesting array was reached at minute 17 of the internal assault, 3 minutes behind schedule because the midsection corridor fight had been harder than the models suggested, and 2 minutes ahead of the revised schedule Darren had updated the fleet on at minute 12. This was how real operations worked, and the teams knew it, and they adjusted. The device was extraordinary to look at. Even in the compressed, grainy footage from the assault team's helmet cameras, footage that was later cleaned up and analyzed at length and shown at every significant military and diplomatic briefing for the next 2 years. It was extraordinary to look at. The array filled a chamber 300 meters across and rose from floor to ceiling in a lattice of crystalline structures and dark metal conduits, whose geometry seemed to belong to a different branch of mathematics than the one humans used. It was beautiful in the way that things can be beautiful when they are very precisely designed for a purpose, before you understand what the purpose is. A trap shaped like a cathedral. The crystalline lattice produced a resonant frequency that the assault team's attached medic later described in her report as difficult to categorize sensorially. It was felt rather than heard, in the chest and behind the eyes, and she described it as grief-adjacent, as though the structure had been calibrated to the frequency of grief specifically, which of course it had. The Vothran technical team operating the array, 9 individuals at various stations around the chamber's perimeter, was present when the assault team breached the door. The engagement was brief. Vothran technical personnel were not frontline fighters. They carried sidearms and had basic defensive training, and they used both, and the assault team dealt with them with controlled, professional efficiency and without unnecessary delay, because the array was still active and the Allied fleet was still in range, and the priority was the array. Sergeant 1 stood in front of the central conduit for 3 seconds. He looked at it. He looked at what it was, not abstractly but concretely, following the logic of its construction from the base conduit upward through the lattice to the collection nodes at the crown of the chamber where the crystalline structures were densest and most active. He understood what he was looking at. The briefing materials had been thorough. A machine for turning loss into fuel. A mechanism for extracting the specific energy produced by sapient beings at the moments of their greatest suffering, and storing it for purposes the technical teams were still working out. 8 months of operation. Hundreds of thousands of beings harvested across half a dozen species. And at the top of the battery, one final charge. The largest single collection event in the array's operational history, triggered by a convoy attack that had killed 19 children. One thought about his daughter. She was 9 years old. Her career plan, stated with great seriousness at the breakfast table approximately 2 weeks before he had shipped out, involved simultaneously being an astronaut and a deep-sea diver, because she had not yet fully accepted that the universe placed constraints on ambition, and one had not told her it did, because he was not sure the universe did, not necessarily, not always. He set the demolition charge at the base of the central conduit. He set a second charge at the junction where the primary collection feeds converged. He set a third at the base of the lattice's right column because it looked structurally critical, and the demolitions instructor who had trained him 17 years ago had always said, "When in doubt, put another charge on the thing that looks structurally critical." "Firing position," he said into the radio, and walked back to the door and through it, and the teams moved clear of the chamber entrance. The array came down with a sound that was less like an explosion and more like a held breath released, a pressure differential spreading outward through the corridor walls, followed by a cascade sound, structured and sequential, as the lattice collapsed tier by tier from the base upward in a sequence that was almost elegant. Almost. The crystalline structures fell into each other and fractured, and the resonant frequency stopped, and the silence that replaced it was the specific kind of silence that follows the end of a sound you didn't fully realize you'd been hearing until it stopped. One stood in the corridor and let his radio come back to him and heard, somewhere in the fleet channel, the voice of the tactical coordinator from the Perseverance saying something procedural about Wave 2 repositioning, and he found that he was breathing more slowly than he had been. "Array down," he said into the radio. A pause. Then Voss's voice, not the tactical frequency, the ship-wide command channel, confirmed, "All units, array is down, continue." The battle continued for another 38 minutes at the cradle's periphery and in its deeper corridors, as the remaining Vothran defensive forces were systematically and methodically reduced to irrelevance. Not without cost. Not without the kind of cost that would produce its own casualty manifests, and its own names in its own columns marked killed in action and unrecovered. This was the nature of what they were doing, and everyone who had done it understood the nature going in, and it did not make the cost lighter. It made the cost what it was. Voss monitored the assault feeds from the bridge of the Perseverance, and she thought, in the controlled quiet between tactical updates, about the Vothran plan. She had been thinking about it for 2 days with increasing clarity. The Vothrans had been strategically intelligent. That was true, and she was willing to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it was important. Important for understanding how they had gotten so close to their objective, and important for understanding why they had ultimately failed. They had identified a genuine human vulnerability. The specific, combustive quality of human grief-rage when directed at the small and defenseless, at children, at the category of things that were not supposed to be in harm's way, was real and powerful, and the Vothrans had read it correctly. They had understood that this particular emotional frequency, in sufficient concentration, might power something. They had built the infrastructure to collect it. They had calculated the yield of a targeted strike on a civilian convoy carrying children, and found it sufficient to complete their battery. What they had gotten wrong was the directionality. Human grief-rage was real. It was fuel, but it burned in a particular direction, and that direction was not diffuse. It did not radiate outward equally in all directions the way a harvesting array needed it to in order to be captured and stored. Human grief-rage, in response to something like this, organized itself. It focused. It became a vector. It identified a specific target and moved toward it with an efficiency that was not, in the end, emotional at all. It was the opposite of emotional. It was the thing that happened on the far side of emotion, when emotion had been processed and metabolized, and converted into something that didn't need to feel anything anymore in order to move. The Vothrans had built a device to harvest grief-rage. What they had produced was Operation Response. Post-engagement assessment began at 1400 hours, when the last Vothran defensive position had been cleared, and the Allied fleet had secured the cradle's perimeter. 3 Allied ships lost to the Vothran defensive grid before it fell, 2 human frigates and 1 Anric sovereignty escort vessel, whose entire crew of 14 had been recovered, alive but shaken, from their emergency compartments 6 hours after the engagement ended. 41 soldiers killed in the internal assault. Over 100 wounded, with one's burned shoulder among the comparatively minor entries on that list. Voss walked the Allied commanders through the post-engagement assessment at 1700 hours. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. The thoroughness was how she showed respect for what had been done and what it had cost. Then she told them about the harvesting array. Not the operational facts, those she had shared before the mission. The full picture, what the technical teams were finding as they worked through the cradle's data systems, what the array had actually been doing for 8 months, what it had been building toward, the capacity figures, the collection methodology, the breadth of the network, proxy incidents across 6 species, a pattern of deliberate provocations that no single incident had revealed as a pattern, but that mapped cleanly now together into a grid of collection points spanning half the sector. The Allied commanders in the holographic conference were quiet for a long time after she finished. Ashenmar, whose chromatophores had been cycling steadily throughout the briefing, settled into a color she recognized now, the deep, resolved color that his xenobiologist had told her meant a grief so large it has resolved into action. It stayed there, stable. The convoy, he said carefully, the children. Intended as the final charge in the battery, Voss said. The array was already near capacity. One significant collection event would have completed it. And what would a completed battery have powered? We're working on that, Voss said. The data structures suggest something offensive rather than defensive in nature. The technical teams will have a full assessment in 72 hours. Another silence. We will want to know, Ashenmar said, when you know. I know, Voss said. You'll know when we know. After the conference, she went to her office and sat in the chair behind her desk and did not immediately do anything. She sat with the quality of the silence that had been following her all day, not an empty silence, but a full one, packed with everything that had happened and everything it meant, and everything it was going to mean in the weeks and months and years ahead. The Vothran Compact was going to have to be addressed politically, diplomatically, militarily, at every level and through every available channel. The data from the cradle was going to reshape the sector's understanding of the past 8 months. There was going to be an enormous amount of work. She knew how to do work. Work was manageable. She pulled the folder from the corner of her desk. The photograph of Pell, which an ensign had recovered from the briefing amphitheater and brought to her because bringing it to the senior officer on duty had seemed like the correct thing to do. The serious face, the handmade badge. Future marine biologist. She set it in the center of the desk where she could see it. She was going to keep it, not in a file, not in a log, not formalized in any administrative way. She was going to keep it on her desk where she could see it because she thought it was important to see it. She thought it was important to be reminded, in the flat gray light of operational reality, of what exactly the stakes had been and what exactly the response had amounted to. Not the tactical response, the human one. The one that had been building in corridors and briefing rooms and simulation bays and maintenance decks for 56 hours before a single shot was fired. Pell had wanted to be 2 things at once, because the constraints of the universe had not yet made themselves clear to her. Voss thought that was probably the truest thing she knew about the girl, about what the girl had been, about what all 19 of them had been, in their different specific ways, small people in the early stages of becoming whatever they were going to become, full of unformed plans and serious handshakes and career badges and hand-drawn pictures of waiting families. The response to their deaths had been immediate. The response to their deaths had been absolute. Voss sat in her office with the photograph in the center of her desk and the stars outside her port, and the after-action reports already queuing in her inbox, and thought that she would remember this. Not the battle, not the array, not the tactical geometry of response, but this. The 7 minutes in the briefing amphitheater when 63 pilots stood up one by one to put something on the table. The particular quality of that silence when the last of them sat back down. Moss found her an hour later. He knocked on the open door and she gestured him in, and he sat in the chair across the desk and looked at the photograph. "I heard one's team played it perfectly in there," he said. "They did. The Kethani units too. Ashenmar's people are excellent," Voss said. "I told him so." "Good." Moss looked at the photograph for another moment. "The Anric sovereignty has formally requested a permanent seat in the Joint Council. Their delegation head sent a message about an hour ago. She said," he paused, consulting something on his data pad. "She said, 'We came because of the children and we will stay because of what we saw done for them.' She asked permission to quote that in their formal filing." "Permission granted," Voss said. "It's going to be a different sector in 5 years," Moss said, "after all this." "Maybe," Voss said. "That depends on what the Vothrans do next, and what everyone else decides the cradle means." "What do you think it means?" Voss thought about this honestly. Outside the port, the stars were doing what stars did, burning, indifferent, permanent. "I think it means they were close," she said. "I think it means they had a plan that might have worked and they made one mistake, which is that they calculated the yield of human grief without calculating what grief does to the thing that contains it, what it makes it capable of." She paused. "They wanted a power source. They found one. They just couldn't control the direction it moved." Moss was quiet for a moment. "Where's Solis?" he asked. "Maintenance Bay," Voss said. "Or the debrief. I told the wing coordinator to give them an hour before they filed." That was right. Captain Solis had landed her fighter at 16:12 hours and had not gone immediately to the debrief. She had climbed down from the cockpit and sat on the deck with her back against the landing strut and had not moved for approximately 15 minutes. The deck crew gave her room. They gave Rafferty room too when he landed 3 minutes behind her. This was the culture. You gave people the 15 minutes. Everyone got the 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, Solis stood up, straightened her flight suit, reached into her left breast pocket. The paper was still there. She took it out and looked at the 19 names for a long time. The paper had gotten a little damp from the flight temperature fluctuations in the cockpit, the humidity differential between flight suit and the cooling system, ordinary physics, and the ink had bled very slightly at 2 of the names. She could still read them. She could still read all of them. She folded the paper back along its original crease lines and put it back where it had been. She was going to carry it. She had decided this before the mission and she confirmed it now. She was going to carry it until she was done flying, and then she was going to put it somewhere permanent and appropriate. She hadn't decided where yet. She had some time to figure that out. Sergeant 1 found her in the corridor outside the debrief room. He had cleaned up, showered, changed, had his shoulder looked at, but not entirely. There was still a streak of Vothran dust in the crease of his right ear that the cleanup had missed. He looked at her for a moment with the specific look of one person who has done a hard thing, alongside another person, and is trying to determine whether to say so. "Good flying up there," he said. "Good shooting down there," she said. They stood in the corridor. Through the closed door they could hear the voices of the debrief already underway, the flat, procedural rhythms of operational after-action work, the language that reduced everything to angles and distances and timing intervals. "Did you hear about the array?" one said. "What they're finding in the data?" "I heard the summary. They were going to use it. Whatever it powered, they were close to done." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone calculated that the convoy gave them enough charge to run whatever they were planning." "I know. You think they understood what they were actually collecting, the Vothrans?" Solis considered this the way one had asked it, not rhetorically, but genuinely. He was asking something he actually wanted to think through. "I think they understood the chemistry," she said. "I think they ran the numbers and the numbers told them grief rage was power, and so they went out and collected it. The way you'd collect fuel for any other system. They were methodical about it. But fuel doesn't care what it burns for. It just burns." She paused. "I don't think they understood what it does to the people who feel it, what it makes them, what direction it moves." One nodded slowly. He turned this over. "What does it make them?" he asked. Solis put her hand against the door of the debrief room. Behind it, the voices continued, calm, professional, proceeding through the events of the day in the careful language of people who would go home eventually, who had children of their own, who had photographs and lists and small talismans in their pockets, and would carry them for a long time without explanation to anyone who had not done the same. "Unified," she said. She pushed the door open and they went in. Outside, beyond the hull of the Perseverance, in the dark between systems, the Allied fleet was already reforming, individual ships returning to their separate formations and their separate purposes, but carrying something with them now that had not been there 72 hours ago. The Cathani carriers moved alongside the human frigates without the fractional hesitation that had characterized Allied fleet maneuvering for 3 years. The Anric sovereignty ships held their position without being asked. Deep in the cradle, the technical teams worked through the data and shifts, building a picture of something that had been hidden for 8 months, and that was now going to be known. Ocean Mars' flagship transmitted a quiet acknowledgement to the Perseverance as the fleet dispersed. A single short message in Standard, which was not any of their native languages but was the one they shared. "We will remember this." On the bridge of the Perseverance, Voss read it and replied, "So will they." It was the right answer. It was also a promise, the older kind, the kind that needed no enforcement mechanism because it was its own enforcement. The Vothran Compact had designed a system to extract and redirect the deepest responses of sapient beings to loss. They had built it carefully over 8 months. They had nearly completed it. Instead, it had done something far simpler and far more permanent. It had shown every civilization in range exactly what happened when you killed children and expected the grief to stay diffuse. When you built a trap, expecting the reaction to power your machine. The reaction had powered something. Just not what they'd intended. The cradle sat dark in the gravitational midpoint between 2 uninhabited systems, its lights going out one by one as the Allied teams worked through its chambers, its defense grid already gone, its harvesting array a pile of crystalline debris at the bottom of a 300-meter chamber. It would be studied for years. It would change things for years. Its data would be parsed, and its architecture would be reverse-engineered, and its implications would be debated in councils and war colleges and diplomatic chambers across the sector, for as long as the sector could hold the conversation. And the stars burned on, cold and permanent, unchanged. And the humans were still there, carrying what they carried, going where they were going, unable, constitutionally, fundamentally, by every measure of what they were, to be anything other than exactly this. The technical team's lead analyst, a woman named Dr. Tova Reis, who had been recruited from the Xenotechnology Division 2 years earlier, and who had not previously worked in active combat theater assessment, filed her preliminary report on the Cradle's data systems at 200 hours the following morning. She filed it directly to Voss's inbox with a header that read Urgent, Review Before Sleep, which was either an assumption about Voss's habits or an instruction, and which Voss found she did not resent because it was accurate in both senses. She read it in her office with the photograph still on the desk and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. The array had been designed as a Stage 1 collection system. Reis's report was careful with its language in a way that Voss immediately recognized as the language of someone who had looked at something disturbing and was reporting on it as precisely as possible because precision was the only available protection against it. The array was Stage 1. There was a Stage 2. The Stage 2 architecture had not been built into the cradle. It had been built somewhere else, a separate facility, location still being determined from the cradle's navigation logs, which were fragmented but recoverable. The Stage 1 array collected and stored the emotional energy. The Stage 2 facility processed it into something else, something Rias's team had not yet been able to fully classify but which appeared, from the data structures and the calibration records and the design specifications recovered from the cradle's engineering files, to be weaponized. Not a power source. A weapon that operated on sapient nervous systems, something that, deployed at sufficient scale, could induce the emotional states it had originally been harvested from. Grief, terror, despair. On an entire population, simultaneously. Voss sat with this for a long time. The Vothrans had not been trying to power a ship or a weapon of the conventional kind. They had been trying to build a thing that could take the emotional devastation of a species and reflect it back at that species, amplified, weaponized, turned into a tool of subjugation. They had spent 8 months collecting raw material. They had been 3 charges away from having enough to run the first test. The convoy had been intended to close that gap. She thought about Pell again. She thought about the serious face and the badge and the handshake and the laugh that had caught her off guard. She thought about what it would have meant, not strategically, not tactically, but to Pell specifically, if any version of the Stage 2 weapon had ever been deployed. The wave of amplified grief washing through a population. The engineered despair. The manufacturing of the specific state that the Vothrans had apparently decided was humanity's most exploitable vulnerability. She thought about the 7 minutes in the briefing amphitheater, 63 people standing up one at a time, the table at the front of the room. She thought about Ashenmar's chromatophores cycling through a color that had no clean translation. She thought about "We heard what happened, we came." She forwarded Rias's report to the Allied Council with a 3-line cover note. Stage 2 facility is the next objective. We have the navigation data. Recommend immediate council session at 800. We are not done. Then she picked up the cup of cold tea and finished it because it was there, and she had learned a long time ago that the habit of finishing what was in front of you, even the small and symbolic things, was a habit worth keeping. At 800 hours, the Allied Council met again. The conversation was shorter than the first one. The navigation logs, as reconstructed by Rias's team overnight, placed the Stage 2 facility in a System 3 FTL jumps from the cradle, uninhabited, deep in the buffer zone between Vothran claimed and unclaimed space. It would take 6 days to position an adequate strike force. The Vothran Compact, having just lost their primary collection facility and apparently a significant portion of their interdiction capability, was unlikely to have the resources to accelerate whatever timeline they had been working toward. But unlikely was not the same as impossible. 6 days, Ashenmar said. 6 days, Voss confirmed. Then we have 6 days to prepare. He said it simply, without weight, the way you stated a fact that didn't need emphasis because it was already understood. The Allied Council had spent 14 hours conducting the most successful coordinated strike operation in the sector's recent history. 6 days was not a difficulty. 6 days was adequate preparation time. Voss looked around the assembled commanders in the holographic conference, faces and forms from 7 civilizations, different biologies and different languages and different histories, united by a translation protocol and a shared 17 seconds of convoy telemetry, and she thought about the word Ashenmar had used the day before, the word in his oldest language, the act that removes itself from the realm of politics. The Vothrans had taken that step first. They had placed what they did outside the territory where normal responses applied, where restraint was a virtue and escalation was a risk to be managed. They had done it with calculation, deliberately, and what they had produced was a situation that also existed outside that territory, where the calculus was different, where the word that applied was not proportionate or measured or justified but simply necessary. Reconvene in 48 hours for detailed operational planning, Voss said. I want full asset availability assessments from all commands by then. Rias's team will have a more complete picture of the Stage 2 facility's defensive profile. We plan from complete information. The commands acknowledged. The conference ended. Voss spent the rest of the day doing the 1,000 necessary procedural tasks that followed an engagement of this scale. After-action reports, casualty notifications. She wrote every one personally, which took 4 hours. She had always done this. Equipment assessments, supply requisitions, communications with Fleet Command at the sector's center, which was 6 FTL jumps away, and which was, she could tell from the tone of the transmissions, still catching up to what had happened. Fleet Command operated on timelines calibrated to deliberation. What had happened in the last 72 hours had operated on a different timeline. She filed the full report and attached Rias's assessment, and let Fleet Command read it, and sent a follow-up flagged urgent that said, in the flat official language of intercommand communication, that she intended to proceed to the Stage 2 facility on the recommended timeline and requested authorization. She received, 4 hours later, a response that said, in the same flat official language, its officialness doing nothing to disguise the fact that the person who wrote it had clearly read Rias's report very carefully, authorized, proceed as planned, full resources committed. In the evening, after the crew had cycled through the first post-engagement shift change, and the Perseverance had settled into its operational rhythm, Voss walked to the fighter bay. Solis was there. This was not surprising. Solis had completed the debrief and eaten something in the mess and slept 4 hours and was back at her fighter, running post-mission diagnostics that the maintenance crew had already run and documented. She was running them again. This also was not surprising. Voss leaned against the landing strut of the adjacent fighter and watched her work for a moment. You're already thinking about the next one, Voss said. It was not a question. Stage 2 facility, Solis said, not looking up from the diagnostic panel. I heard. Word travels. It always does. Solis closed the diagnostic panel and finally looked over at her. 6 days. Adequate time, Voss said. Solis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the weapon they were building. For what it was going to do, if they'd had enough charge. We're not going to find out what it was going to do, Voss said, because they didn't get the charge. Because of the convoy. Because of what the convoy made us. Solis understood this. Voss could see her understanding it, the specific way her expression shifted, not into something more resolved, but into something quieter. Like the movement of something settling into the position it was always going to end up in. We're going to finish it, Solis said. We're going to finish it, Voss confirmed. She pushed off the landing strut and walked back through the bay toward the corridor. Behind her, she heard Solis open the diagnostic panel again and begin running the next check. 41 of theirs were dead. 19 children were dead. The Vothran Compact had built a machine to turn loss into a weapon and had nearly completed it, and the thing they had calculated as their power source had instead powered the sequence of events that had destroyed the machine and killed the team that ran it and located the next facility and assembled the Allied coalition that was now positioned to end the project entirely. The math was not what the Vothrans had expected. But then, Voss thought, the math never was. That was the calculation they kept missing, the one that didn't appear in their models because to model it you would need to have experienced it, and the nature of the thing made that experience incompatible with the kind of thinking that built harvesting arrays. Greyfrage was real. It was powerful. It organized itself. And once it was organized, once it had a direction and a target and 63 pilots standing up one by one in a briefing room to put something on a table, it did not stop because the first objective was achieved. It stopped when there was nothing left to stop for. The Stage 2 facility was 3 FTL jumps away. 6 days. That was adequate. That was more than adequate. The stars outside the Perseverance's observation ports burned the same way they always burned, cold, indifferent, ancient, paying no attention to the small determined things moving through the space between them. But the small determined things were moving, and they were carrying what they carried, and the direction they were moving in was not going to change. Not for 6 days. Not after that, until it was done.